So, Chapter 9, 160 and 168. Yeah, personally, I like doing the notes before doing the textbook reading, but she said this is the homework, so here we go. Okay. The American Revolution was not a revolution in the sense of a radical or total change. It did not suddenly and violently overturn the entire political and social framework, as later occurred in the French and Russian revolutions. What happened was accelerated evolution rather than outright revolution. During the conflict itself, people went on working and praying, marrying and playing. Many of them were not seriously disturbed by the actual fighting, and the most isolated communities scarcely knew that a war was on. But at war's end, all Americans faced a great question. What would be done with the independence that had been so dearly won? A shaky start toward union. Prospects for erecting a last regime were far from bright. It was always difficult to set up a new government, and then undoubtedly difficult to set a new type of government. Disruptive forces stalked the land. The departure of some 80,000 loyalists left the new ship of state without conservative ballast, fostering sometimes unsound experimentation and innovation. Patriots had fought the war with a high degree of disunity, but they had at least concurred on allegiance to a common cause. Now even that was gone. It would have been almost a miracle if any government fashioned in all this confusion had long endured. Hard times, the Beta War regimes, set in shortly after the war and hit bottom in 1786. As if other troubles were not enough, British manufacturers with dimmed-up surpluses began flooding the American market with cut-rate goods. War-baby American industries, in particular, suffered industrial colic from such ruthless competition. One Philadelphia newspaper in 1783 urged readers to don home-stitched garments of homespun cloth. Of foreign gewgaws, let's be free, and wear the webs of liberty. Yet hopeful signs could be discerned. The 13 sovereign states were basically alike in governmental structure and functioned under similar constitutions. Americans enjoyed a rich political inheritance derived partly from Britain and partly from their own homegrown devices for self-government. Finally, they were blessed with political leaders of a high order and men like George Washington, James Madison, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton. Ultimately, this formative moment, while more evolution than revolution, did usher in some striking changes in social structures and customs, economic practices, and political institutions, as well as ideas about race, class, and gender. Constitution making in the states. The Continental Congress in 1776 called upon the colonies to draft new constitutions. In effect, the Continental Congress was actually asking the colonies to summon themselves into being as new states. The sovereignty of these new states, according to the theory of republicanism, would rest on the authority of the people. For a time, the manufacture of governments was even more pressing than the manufacture of gunpowder. Although the states of Connecticut and Rhode Island merely retouched their colonial charters, Constitution writers elsewhere worked tirelessly to capture on black-inked parchment and the Republican spirit of the age. Massachusetts contributed one especially noteworthy innovation when it called a special convention to draft its constitution and then submitted the final draft directly to the people for ratification. Once adopted in 1780, the Massachusetts Constitution could be changed only by other specially called Constitutional Convention. This procedure was later imitated in the drafting and ratification of the Federal Constitution. Adopted almost a decade before the Federal Constitution, the Massachusetts Constitution remains the longest-lived constitution in the world. The newly penned state constitutions had many features in common. Their similarity, as it turned out, made easier the drafting of a workable federal charter when the time was ripe. In the British tradition, a constitution was not a written document, but rather an accumulation of laws, customs, and precedents. Americans invented something different. The documents they drafted were contracts that defined the powers of government, as did the old colonial charters, but they drew their authority from the people, not from the royal seal of a distant king. As written documents, the state constitutions were intended to represent a fundamental law, superior to the transient whims of ordinary legislation. Most of these documents included bills of rights, specifically guaranteeing long-prized liberties against later legislative encroachment. Most of them required the annual election of legislators, who were thus forced to stay in touch with the mood of the people. All of them deliberately created weak executive and judicial branches, at least by present-day standards. A generation of quarreling with His Majesty's officials had implanted a deep distrust of despotic governors and arbitrary judges. In all the new state governments, the legislators, as presumably the most democratic branch of government, were given sweeping powers. But as Thomas Jefferson warned, 173 despots in a legislature would surely be as oppressive as one. Many Americans soon came to agree with him. The democratic charter of the new state legislatures was vividly reflected by the presence of many members from the recently enfranchised poorer western districts. Their influence was powerfully felt in their several successful movements to relocate state capitals from the haughty eastern seaports into the less pretentious interior. In the Revolutionary era, the capitals of New Hampshire, New York, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia were all moved westward. These geographical shifts portended political shifts that deeply discomfited many more conservative Americans. Excuse me. Economic crosscurrents. Economic changes begotten by the war were likewise noteworthy, but not overwhelming. States seized control of former crown lands, and although rich speculators had their day, many of the large loyalist holdings were confiscated and eventually cut up into small farms. Roger Morris's huge estate in New York, for example, was sliced into 250 parcels, thus accelerating the speed of economic democracy. The frightful excesses of the French Revolution were avoided, partly because cheap land was easily available and because America had so few deeply entrenched land aristocrats to be overthrown. It is highly significant that in the United States, economic democracy, broadly speaking, preceded political democracy. A sharp stimulus was given to manufacturing by the pre-war non-importation agreements and later by the war itself. Goods that had formerly been imported from Britain were mostly cut off, and the ingenious Yankees were forced to make their own. 10 years after the Revolution, busy Brandywine Creek, south of Philadelphia, was turning the water wheels of numerous mills along an 8-mile stretch, yet America remained overwhelmingly a nation of soil tillers. Economically speaking, independence had drawbacks. Much of the coveted commerce of Britain was still reserved for the loyal parts of the empire. American ships were now barred from British and British West Indies harbors. Fisheries were disrupted, and bounties for ship stores had abruptly ended. In some respects, the hated British navigation laws were more disagreeable after independence than before. New commercial outlets, fortunately, compensated partially for the loss of old ones. Americans could now trade freely with foreign nations, subject to local restrictions, a boon they had not enjoyed in the days of mercantilism. Enterprising Yankee shippers ventured boldly and profitably into the Baltic and China seas. In 1784, the Empress of China, carrying a valuable weed, ginseng, that was highly prized by Chinese herb doctors as a cure for impotence, led the way into the East Asian markets. Yet the general economic picture was far from rosy. War had spawned demoralizing extravagance, speculation, and profiteering, with profits for some as indecently high as 300%. State governments had borrowed more during the war than they could ever hope to repay. Runaway inflation had been ruinous to many citizens, and Congress had failed in its feeble attempts to curb economic laws. The average citizen was probably worse off financially at the end of the shooting than at the start. The whole economic and social atmosphere was unhealthy. A newly rich class of profiteers was noisily conspicuous, whereas many once wealthy people were left destitute. The controversy leading to the Revolutionary War had bred a keen distaste for taxes and encouraged disrespect for the majesty of the law generally. John Adams had been shocked when gleefully told by a horse jockey neighbor that the courts of justice were all closed, a plight that proved to be only temporary. Okay, wait. I'm going to read the Examining the Evidence, the Copley family portrait, or Copley, I don't know. A portrait painting like this one by John Singleton Copley documents physical likeness, clothing styles, and other material possessions typical of an era, but it can do more than that. In the execution of the painting itself, the preeminent portrait painter of colonial America revealed important values of his time. Copley's composition and use of light emphasized the importance of the mother in the family. Mrs. Copley is the visual center of the painting. The light falls predominantly on her, and she provides the focus of activity for the family group. Although Copley had moved to England in 1774 to avoid disruptions of the war, he had made radical friends in his hometown of Boston and surely had imbibed the sentiment of the age about Republican motherhood, a sentiment that revered women as homemakers and mothers, the cultivators of good Republican values in young citizens. What other prevailing attitudes about gender and age, for example, might this painting reveal? Okay, creating a confederation. The Second Continental Congress of Revolutionary Days was little more than a conference of ambassadors from the 13 states. It was totally without constitutional authority, and in general did only what it dared to do, though it asserted some control over military affairs and foreign policy. In nearly all respects, the 13 states were sovereign, for they coined money, raised armies and navies, and erected tariff bearers. The legislature of Virginia even ratified separately the Treaty of Alliance of 1778 with France. Shortly before declaring independence in 1776, Congress appointed a committee to draft a written constitution for the new nation. The finished product was the Articles of Confederation. Adopted by Congress in 1774, it was translated into French after the Battle of Saratoga so as to convince France that America had a genuine government in the making. The Articles were not ratified by all 13 states until 1781, less than 8 months before the victory at Yorktown. The chief apple of discord was Western lands. 6 of the jealous states, including Pennsylvania and Maryland, had no holdings beyond the Allegheny Mountains. 7, notably New York and Virginia, were favored with the enormous acreage, in most cases on the basis of earlier charter grants. The 6 land-hungry states argued that the more fortunate states would not have retained possession of this splendid prize if all the other states had not fought for it also. A major complaint was that the land-rich states could sell their trans-Allegheny tracts and thus pay off pensions and other debts incurred in the common cause. States without such holdings would have to tax themselves heavily to defray these obligations. Why not turn the whole western area over to the central government? Unanimous approval of the Articles of Confederation by the 13 states was required, and land-starved Maryland stubbornly held out until March 1, 1781. Maryland at length gave in when New York surrendered its western claims, and Virginia seemed about to do so. To sweeten the pill, Congress pledged itself to dispose of these vast areas for the common benefit. It further agreed to carve from the new public domain not colonies, but a number of republican states, which in time would be admitted to the Union on terms of complete equality with all the others. This extraordinary commitment faithfully reflected the anti-colonial spirit of the Revolution, and the pledge was later fully redeemed in the famed Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Fertile public lands thus transferred to the central government proved to be an invaluable bond of union. The states that had thrown their heritage into the common pot had to remain in the Union, and they were to reap their share of the advantages from the land sales. An army of westward-moving pioneers purchased their farms from the federal government, directly or indirectly, and they learned to look to the national capital, rather than to state capitals, with a consequent weakening of local influence. Finally, a uniform national land policy was made possible. The Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution. The Articles of Confederation, some have said Articles of Confusion, provided for a loose confederation, or a form league of friendship. 13 independent states were thus linked together for joint action in dealing with common problems, such as foreign affairs. A clumsy Congress was to be the chief agency of government. There was no executive branch, George III had left a bad taste, and the vital judicial arm was left almost exclusively to the states. Congress, though dominant, was severely hobbled. Each state had a single vote, so some 68,000 Rhode Islanders had the same voice as more than 10 times that many Virginians. All bills dealing with subjects of importance required the support of 9 states. Any amendment of the Articles themselves required unanimous ratification. Unanimity was almost impossible, and this meant that the amending process, perhaps fortunately, was unworkable. If it had been workable, the Republic might have struggled along with the patched-up Articles of Confederation rather than replace it with an effective constitution. The shackled Congress was weak, and was purposely designed to be weak. Suspicious states, having just won control over taxation and commerce from Britain, had no desire to yield their newly acquired privileges to an American Parliament, even one of their own making. 2 handicaps of Congress were crippling. It had no power to regulate commerce, and this loophole left the states free to establish different and often conflicting laws regarding tariffs and navigation. Nor could Congress enforce its tax collection program. It established a tax quota for each of the states and then asked them please to contribute their share on a voluntary basis. The central authority, a government by supplication, was lucky if in any year it received 1/4 of its requests. The feeble national government in Philadelphia could advise and advocate and appeal, but in dealing with the independent states it could not command or coerce or control. It could not act directly upon the individual citizens of a sovereign state. It could not even protect itself against gross indignities. Indignities. In 1783, a group of mutinous Pennsylvania soldiers, whose pay was in arrears, marched to Philadelphia and made a threatening demonstration in front of Independence Hall. After Congress appealed in vain to state for protection, its members fled to safety at Princeton College in New Jersey. The new Congress, with all its paper powers, was even less effective than the old Continental Congress, which had wielded no constitutional powers at all. Yet the Articles of Confederation, weak though they were, proved to be a landmark in government. They were for those days a model of what a loose confederation could be. Thomas Jefferson enthusiastically hailed the new structure as the best one existing, or that ever did exist. To compare it with the European governments, he thought, was like comparing heaven and hell. Although the Confederation was praiseworthy as confederations went, the troubled times demanded not a loosely woven confederation, but a tightly knit federation. This involved the yielding by the states of their sovereignty to a complete recast federal government, which in turn would leave them free to control their local affairs. In spite of their defects, the anemic Articles of Confederation were a significant stepping stone toward the present Constitution. They clearly outlined the general powers that were to be exercised by the central government, such as making treaties and establishing a postal service. As the first written Constitution of the Republic, the Articles kept alive the flickering ideal of union and held the states together, until such times as they were ripe for the establishment of a strong Constitution by peaceful, evolutionary methods. Without this intermediary jump, the states probably would never have consented to the breathtaking leap from the old Boycott Association of 1774 to the Constitution of the United States. Landmarks and land laws. Handcuffed though the Congress of the Confederation was, it succeeded in passing supremely far-sighted pieces of legislation. These related to an immense part of the public domain recently acquired from the states and commonly known as the Old Northwest. This area of land lay northwest of the Ohio River, east of the Mississippi River, and south of the Great Lakes. The first of these red-letter laws was the Land Ordinance of 1785. It provided that an acreage of the Old Northwest should be sold and that the proceeds should be used to help pay off the national debt. The vast area was to be surveyed before sale and settlement, thus forestalling the endless confusion and lawsuits. It was to be divided into townships 6 miles square, each of which in turn was to be split into 36 sections of 1 square mile each. The 16th section of each township was set aside to be sold for the benefit of the public schools, a priceless gift to education in the Northwest. The orderly settlement of the Northwest Territory, where the land was methodically surveyed and titles duly recorded, contrasted sharply with the chaos south of the Ohio River, where uncertain ownership was the norm and fraud was rampant. Even more noteworthy was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which related to the governing of the Old Northwest. This law came to grips with the problem of how a nation should deal with its colonies, the same problem that had bedeviled its king in the Parliament in London. The solution provided by the Northwest Ordinance was a judicious compromise: temporary tutelage, then permanent equality. First, there would be 2 evolutionary territorial stages during which the area would be subordinate to the federal government. Then, when a territory could boast 60,000 inhabitants, it might be admitted by Congress as a state, with all the privileges of the 13 charter members. This is precisely what the Continental Congress had promised the states when they surrendered their lands in 1781. The ordinance was also forbade slavery in the Old Northwest, a path-breaking step, though it exempted slaves already present. The wisdom of Congress in handling this explosive problem deserves warm praise. If it had attempted to chain the new territories in permanent subordination, a second American Revolution almost certainly would have erupted in later years, fought this time by the West against the East. Congress thus nearly solved the seemingly insoluble problem of the empire. The scheme worked so well that its basic principles were ultimately carried over from the Old Northwest to the other frontier areas. The world's ugly duckling. Foreign relations, especially with London, remained troubled during these anxious years of Confederation. Britain resented the stab in the back from its rebellious offspring, and for 8 years refused to send a minister to America's backwoods capital. London suggested, with barbed irony, that if it sent one, it would have to send 13. Britain flatly declined to make a commercial treaty or to repeal its ancient navigation laws. Lord Sheffield, whose ungenerous views prevailed, argued persuasively in a widely sold pamphlet that Britain would win back America's trade anyhow. Commerce, he insisted, would naturally follow old channels, so why go to the Americans hat in hand? The British also officially closed their profitable West Indies trades to the United States, though the Yankees, with their time-tested skill in smuggling, illegally partook nonetheless. Scheming British agents were also active along the far-flung northern frontier. They intrigued with the disgruntled Allen brothers of Vermont and sought to annex that rebellious area to Britain. Along the northern border, the Redcoats continued to hold a chain of trading posts on U.S. soil, and there they maintained their fur trade with the Indians. One plausible excuse for remaining was the failure of the American states to honor their treaty of peace in regard to debts and loyalists. But the main purpose of Britain in hanging on was probably to curry favor with the Indians and keep their tomahawks lined up on the side of the king as a barrier against future American attacks on Canada. All these grievances against Britain were maddening to patriotic Americans. Some citizens demanded with more heat than wisdom that the United States force the British into line by imposing restrictions on their imports to America. But Congress could not control commerce, and the states refused to adopt a uniform tariff policy. Some easy states deliberately lowered their tariffs in order to attract an unfair share of trade. Spain, though recently an enemy of Britain, was opened unfriendly to the new public. It controlled the mouth of the all-important Mississippi, down which the pioneers of Tennessee and Kentucky were forced to float their produce. In 1784, Spain closed the river to American commerce, threatening the West with strangulation. Spain likewise claimed a large area north of the Gulf of Mexico, including a part of the West Florida, granted to the United States by the British in 1783. At Natchez, on disputed soil, it held an important fort. It also schemed with the neighboring Indians, grievously antagonized by the rapacious land policies of Georgia and North Carolina, to hem in the Americans east of the Appalachians. Spain and Britain together, radiating their influence out among resentful Indian tribes, prevented America from exercising effective control over about half of its total territory. Even France, America's comrade in arms, cooled off now that it had humbled Britain. The French demanded the repayment of money loaned during the war and restricted trade with their bustling West Indies and other ports. Pirates of the North African states, including the arrogant Dey of Algiers, Day of Algiers were ravaging America's Mediterranean commerce and enslaving Yankee sailors. The British purchased protection for their own subjects, and as colonists, the Americans had enjoyed this shield. But as an independent nation, the United States was too weak to fight and too poor to bribe. A few Yankee shippers engaged in the Mediterranean trade with forged British protection papers, but not all were so bold or so lucky. All right. John Jay, Secretary for Foreign Affairs, derived some hollow satisfaction from these insults. He hoped they would at least humiliate the American people into framing a new government at home that would be strong enough to command respect abroad. Okay, the horror specter of anarchy. Economic storm clouds continued to loom in the mid-1780s. The requisition system of raising money was breaking down. Some of the states refused to pay anything, while complaining bitterly about the tyranny of King Congress. Interest on the public debt was piling up at home, and the nation's credit was evaporating abroad. Individual states were getting out of hand. Quarrels over boundaries generated numerous minor pitched battles. Some of the states were levying duties on goods from their neighbors. New York, for example, taxed firewood from Connecticut and cabbages from New Jersey. A number of the states were again starting to grind out depreciated paper currency, and a few of them had passed laws sanctioning the semi-worthless rag money. As a contemporary rhymester put it, bankrupts their creditors with rage pursue, no stop, no mercy, from the debtor crew. An alarming uprising, known as Shays' Rebellion, flared up in western Massachusetts in 1786. Impoverished backcountry farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, were losing their farms through mortgage foreclosures and tax delinquencies. Led by Captain Daniel Shays, a veteran of the Revolution, these desperate debtors demanded that the state issue paper money, lighten taxes, and suspend property takeovers. Hundreds of angry agitators, again seizing their muskets, attempted to enforce their demands. Massachusetts authorities responded with drastic action. Supported partly by contributions from wealthy citizens, they raised a small army. Several skirmishes occurred. At Springfield, 3 Shayites were killed and 1 was wounded, and the movement collapsed. Daniel Shays, who believed that he was fighting anew against tyranny, was condemned to death, but was later pardoned. Shays' followers were crushed, but the nightmarish memory lingered on. The Massachusetts legislature soon passed debtor relief laws of the kind Shays had championed, seemingly confirming the Thomas Jefferson's fear of democratic despotism. An elective despotism was not the government we fought for, Jefferson wrote. The outbursts of Shays and others distressed debtors struck fear in the hearts of the propertied class. The propertied class, who began to suspect that the revolution had created a monster of malocracy. Unbridled republicanism, it seemed to many of the elite, had fed an insatiable appetite for liberty that was fast becoming license. In this state of affairs, many citizens feared that civic virtue, the bedrock of republican government, was insufficient to rein in self-interest and greed. It had become undeniably evident, one skeptic sorrowfully lamented, that some malignant disorder had seized upon our body politic. The antidote, a growing minority argued, was stronger central government. A few panicky citizens even talked of importing a European monarch to carry on where George III had failed. How critical were conditions under the Confederation? Conservatives, anxious to safeguard their wealth and position, naturally exaggerated the seriousness of the nation's plight. They were eager to persuade their fellow citizens to amend the Articles of Confederation in favor of a muscular central government. But the poorer states' rights people pooh-hooed at the talk of anarchy. Many were debtors who feared that a powerful federal government would force them to pay their creditors. Yet friends and critics of the Confederation agreed that it needed some strengthening. Popular toasts were cement to the Union and a hoop to the barrel. The chief differences arose over how this goal should be attained and how a maximum degree of states' rights could be reconciled with a strong central government. America probably could have muddled through somehow with amended Articles of Confederation, but the adoption of a completely new constitution certainly spared the Republic much costly indecision, uncertainty, and turmoil. The nationwide picture was actually brightening before the Constitution was drafted. Nearly half the states had not issued semi-worthless paper currency, and some of the monetary black sheep showed signs of returning the sound money fold. Prosperity was beginning to emerge from the fog of depression. By 1789, overseas shipping had largely regained its place in the commercial world. If conditions had been as grim in 1787 as painted by foes of the Articles of Confederation, the move for a new constitution would hardly have encountered such heated opposition. Alrighty. Beginning of chapter 9. Yay.